To our originally it would be the last session, session 9 of our Introduction to Catholic Philosophy, and as I mentioned before, we're adding a 10th one, a bonus one, which I will discuss a little bit more at the end of this one. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So here is a survey of what we've covered so far. We started off with an introduction to philosophy, the concept of wonder, and the relationship between faith and reason. We got a very quick introduction to logic and epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. Then we looked at the history of philosophy in the ancient world. And there we got to meet some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and then Socrates, who is considered kind of the father of philosophy, of Western philosophy. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then the schools of philosophy that followed them, and then a bit about some of the philosophy that went into the New Testament writers. And in session 4, we looked at the philosophy of nature and metaphysics, some basic concepts in that. In 5, some of the history of medieval philosophy, and especially looking at St. Thomas Aquinas and the structure of the Summa and how to read the medieval scholastic disputation writing, philosophical writing. In 6, we looked at ethics and natural law. And then 7, we looked at natural theology. So in there, we were looking at, if we went back to metaphysics, one of the subjects of metaphysics is being as being, so being itself. And then another aspect of metaphysics is the principles of being, and the principle of being, the prime principle of being, is God. So natural theology was where we looked at what we can discover about God purely from reason without divine revelation. 8, we looked at the main trends and schools of modern philosophy and got a little bit of an introduction to St. John Paul II. Today, the title on here says The Creed and Sacraments, Philosophical Foundations. But really what I'm going to be doing is basically two parts. So first, we're going to walk through some examples of how philosophical concepts and methods meet with and explain and extend revealed doctrine. Okay, so we're coming back full circle to where, number 1, we talked about faith and reason. This is going to be applying those two together. What happens when we take doctrines of faith and we employ philosophical methods using those doctrines? And then at the end, I'm going to have my parents on to discuss, or they're here, I'm going to have them take the lead and discuss. What they're going to show us is an example of how a newer philosophical approach to theology can trickle down, so to speak, to everyday ministry and their experience of that. So today, I have no slides. Today is going to be completely discussion driven, and I'll probably alternate a bit between the text itself and mostly probably just looking at all of us together. So if you're looking at this in speaker view, if you haven't figured it out already, you can also look at a gallery view. You can, if you find the gallery view, and that's a way just to view all the faces at once instead of having the main picture pop back and forth whenever the speaker changes. So that's a personal preference of mine to do it that way. Is my microphone soft?
Yes.
All right, let's Let's see, I can fix that a bit. How about now? Is this any better? Good? Okay. Okay. So we're going to jump right in. First, we're going to take a look at St. Thomas Aquinas from the Summa on the Trinity. And so what do you think about these questions here about how there can be several persons in one God, and how we distinguish among persons and substances and wholes and parts and all of that?
John, I'm going to start with a question. Could you possibly, for my benefit, clarify substance versus matter versus accident?
Mm-hmm. So a substance is what it's what a thing is. So a real existing thing, it's what it is and keeps on being. The matter and the form and the accidents. Let's take a look at the difference among these. I'm going to pull up. Maybe I'll pull up a whiteboard here. So we have we'll get blue. So we have substance. Okay, substance is stable. Okay, what I am is what I keep on being, and this is, for me, a man. Okay, which means I keep on being a rational animal, to use the classic medieval formulation of what a man is. Okay, accident.
This is review for everybody. I can't retain this.
No, not at all. It's I'm sure there are others with the same question. So accident is those characteristics that can change without changing the substance. All right, and also the accidents are, you could say, they're founded on, or they're given existence by the substance. So accidents would be brown hair, which I have some of, just not on my head. Blue eyes. Okay, having blue eyes would be accidents. All of these can change. My eye color can change. My hair can change color, and is doing that, and one day will likely disappear, and yet my substance will never change. That's what I keep on being. So when we're talking about, let's see, so we had substance and accidents, and then you asked also about matter, right?
Yes. And also, now that I'm asking, well, no, I'll let you keep talking. I'll figure out the rest.
Oh, no, go ahead. Do you want to finish your?
No, I'll ask in a second.
Okay. So matter, in this case, we want to contrast with form, all right? And these are two of the causes of things. The other two causes, what are the other two causes? Anybody recall?
Essence, or no?
So we have the material cause, the formal cause, and we have two more. So we have efficient, or Aristotle called this the moving cause.
The final cause.
And the final cause, right. The final cause, or the end. All right, these are extrinsic. Okay, these are outside the thing itself. These are intrinsic. These are the causes that are in the thing itself. These are the causes that constitute the thing. So the form is really what gives a thing its substance. Okay? The substance itself, as it exists, is a composite of matter and form. Form is the invisible or the spiritual part. It's what basically makes that matter, this particular matter. For me, this is going to be my flesh and my bones and my organs and all of the atoms and everything that make up me as I exist. What kind of holds them together, so to speak, and continues to have them work and continue to be me as a natural being is the form. So the matter are the things that are in potency, that have the potential to be what the form, whatever the form is calling them to be, in a sense. The matter is kind of what stretches out to the form. Matter is potency, form is act. So this matter, as plus all of the other things that constitute my being, my body, they are given actuality as a man by the form. So the parallel of this in art is if you have a statue, this is going to be a stick figure statue, all right, but pretend this is a statue made out of bronze. It's another classic example of Aristotle. Suppose you start with a chunk of bronze, right? So this stuff, the bronze is just the stuff that can be the statue. And then how does it come to be the statue? Well, by means of a form that's applied to it. Okay. So that's the parallel in natural things. Does that help to answer your question?
Is the suppositum different from or the same as the substance?
Okay, the suppositum answers the question of just what are we referring to? Okay. So suppositum is just sort of a general term to stand in for something of a somewhat indeterminate nature. So Aquinas uses this here in the reply to objection 1 to show that what he's showing is that the word substance is being used, has been used basically in multiple ways. So it's not, if substance were used univocally to refer to man and God, then the first objection here would be a valid objection. Because substance is used analogously, then that this is not, it's not used univocally. So we have a contrast between persons versus substance. And the reason the confusion has arisen is that in Greek, hypostasis is sometimes translated as substance. And if you look in the early church, before the doctrine of the Trinity was really completely formulated, some fathers will refer to 3 substances in one God. So Aquinas says in the reply to objection 1, we're not accustomed to saying 3 substances, we're accustomed to saying 3 persons. And he's clarifying that the confusion surrounding 3 substances in one God has come about as a problem with translation from the Greek into the Latin. And that translation came to be more specified over the years, where hypostasis was translated as person, and then the Greek ousia came to be translated as substance. But before this, sometimes hypostasis was translated as substance, and so if you look at certain renderings, it'll seem like they're saying that there are three substances in God.
And is it fair to say perhaps they were? I mean, it was before the Trinity was fully articulated. Perhaps they were saying there were three substances.
Yeah, basically, and that's kind of the point of my second question here, is that the word substance could have been the term that was used, that came to be used analogously to refer to the three relations in God, but instead the church settled on the term person. So I would say that if a father of the church is saying there are three substances, then if they're maintaining that there are three relations in one God, then that would be correct. But now, with the teaching of the church as it has been handed down and as the doctrine has been developed in language through the centuries, then we would not say substances as that is currently understood. We would say persons.
Back to that first objection. That last sentence talks about three essences or natures. Now, doesn't God have a human nature and he has two natures? One, or he has a human nature, and then I want to say metaphysical nature, but the spiritual nature. I lost the word.
Yeah, just a divine nature. So
divine nature. That's it. Divine nature.
The second person of the Trinity,
right,
has a human nature and a divine nature.
The other ones just have divine nature.
That's right. So the Father and the Spirit only have a divine nature, and that is the same nature. That is the same divine nature as the second person of the Trinity.
Right.
I have a quick question. Also, in three persons, I've also heard it said three beings. Is that incorrect? It should be three persons, not three beings.
That's correct. And why would that be? Anybody else? What does
three beings, you have three gods.
Right, three beings would indicate three gods. But so what does person specify? How does person in God mean something different than it does for us? Because we talk about people as a person as an individual substance, and that's what this first objection, it says, for person is the individual substance of a rational nature. So that makes it sound like in God there are three
forms,
substances, or three forms. That's right. But so what is person in God if it's not a substance or a being?
In the relationship between them.
A relation, that's right. So Aquinas says, we can see this in the reply to objection 3, that this is relations. We're talking about relations, not absolute things. So he says the supreme unity and simplicity of God exclude every kind of plurality of absolute things. So an absolute thing is a being in itself. So an angel is an absolute thing, a substance. A person, a human person, is a substance. A deer, a rock, these are substances. These are absolute things, substances in their own right. So what he's saying is the simplicity and supreme unity of God excludes any kind of plurality, but not the plurality of a relation. So he can't have the plurality of absolute things, but he can have the plurality of relations, because relations are predicated relatively. Well, that's part of the name, right? And they don't, and he says here, they do not import composition in that of which they are predicated. So predicating a relation of God does not define the way God is, quote unquote, composed. So
I find it interesting that in objection 3, he cites Boethius, but then in his reply to objections 3, he cites a later place in the same book.
yeah, so the objection arises from a sentence of Boethius,
Right.
De Trinitate, where Boethius says this is truly one which has no number. And what the objection relies on is that number only means absolute things. So the objector, whoever this this objector is assuming that Boethius is using a definition of number which refers to absolute things. And Aquinas, this is a very powerful thing that Aquinas often does in his replies to the objections, is he uses the very same author who was cited in the objection to refute it. So he says Boethius teaches clearly that these relations do not import composition, and so obviously Boethius cannot mean by plurality or by number, he can't mean absolute things. So number here is meant. He goes on with number in the fourth objection. And what's the deal with that argument, either the objection or the reply? Here he's talking about whole and part.
I couldn't have misunderstood this, but when I was first thinking about it, I was thinking about a number as it exists in a part-whole relationship. But at the end of the day, a number also has an identity, and it's only in our intellect that we have to understand the numbers as in a part-whole relationship. And with God, which is beyond our intellect, that constraint doesn't seem to be as necessary. I could be wrong. But.
Yeah, I think that you're definitely on the right track in the distinction between number as considered of composing composing parts and wholes. So here Aquinas he uses the example of, if you have a group of two men, then one man is a part of that. And that's number taken as it is in the things and the individual absolute independent things considered. But considered more abstractly, then there's no objection to thinking of number in this way. So it's not number of actual independent things, but we're abstracting to count the relations that are in God. So God doesn't exist as whole and part in the way that two men and one man are different parts of a group of three men, right? But there's an absoluteness in the whole which cannot be divided in the way that three things, that a group of three can be divided into individual things.
A connection that I made to that was from what I was reading in Theology for Beginners. And one of the first points the author makes is that God is a spirit, and that a spirit has no parts. And so my question was if that factored into this objection or this reply at all.
It does. So he refers to the simplicity of God in the third objection. And what he's relying on here is some previous arguments from previous articles about the simplicity of God. And that simplicity means that God is utterly indivisible, and that applies to any immaterial thing. Any material thing is divisible. Any immaterial thing is indivisible. So a form of a person is in itself indivisible, and but an actual composite being of matter and form, which is what we are. We're not just plain forms. We're not souls that happen to live in a body, but we are bodies that are given life by the soul. The body is our way of being. So in that sense, we are divisible, somewhat grotesquely. You can divide us up any way you want, but with a being that exists as a pure immaterial spirit, there's no way to divide it. Matter is required for division.
So
All right,
Terry just said,
yeah.
When he talks about, I just lost what I was going to say. Oh yeah, if God there exists a number of persons, they must be whole and part. So in the three persons, you don't have a third of a God, a third of a God, and a third of a God in each one of them. You have a whole God. You have one, the same God, fully and entirety, simplistically, in all three of them, and they're all the same. It's not divided into third. That's sort of what I got out of that last objection.
That's right. That's a really good. That's a better way to put that.
Okay.
Yeah. So and I think that's why he finds the idea of relation to be so useful, because one thing can have many different relations without being divided up, right?
Right.
So even if go ahead, Gerri.
So the place this loses me or confuses me is when you consider the teaching that because God is one, anything we attribute to the Father also is done by the Holy Spirit, also is done by the Son. Because they're all one. We just the word part, I forget what it is, but we attribute them to one of the three persons of the Trinity. Well, that gives me pauses when we talk about the second person becoming man. Can we attribute that to the Father? Can we say that this is the Father?
So that's a really great question. How can we, if we have one God, how can we have predications that apply to the different persons that don't apply to the others? Because as Gerri's saying, we don't say that God the Father became man. So this is going to be something St. Thomas develops later in the Summa, and I think that it just arises from the fact that with a relation, and we can think of this analogously with ourselves. With a relation, there are some things that can be predicated of that relation that are not predicated of other relations. If an analogy, and this is where we're using relation analogously with human persons and with God. I'm a son with respect to my parents, right? So that being a son so there are things that can be predicated of me as insofar as I am a son. And then there are other things that can be predicated of me insofar as I am a father or a brother. So, but it's still me, right? I have these different relations that have different distinct meanings, but it's still me that holds all of those relations, a single substance. So I think that would be a great thing to look at, to go on from here, Gerri, to sate your curiosity and find those places in the Summa where St. Thomas deals with those more specifically. So let's go ahead on to the second reading, still in St. Thomas. Now we're on to the sacraments and Eucharistic theology. So any ideas here? Any surprises or questions or anything else?
I realized my question was about the second reading and not the first reading, so.
Oh, okay. You mean about substance and accidents and matter and everything?
Yeah.
So what can you relate any of St. Thomas' arguments here about why it must be the case that the form of bread doesn't remain after the consecration?
It's because the primary mode of being has changed. The bread as form is changed into the body of Christ. It's a different substance.
Right. It's a different substance. So now let's take a look. I think something that's an objection that he deals with on here. Let's take a look at the third objection. It says the proper operation of a thing follows its substantial form. This is the objection. But what remains in this sacrament nourishes and performs every operation which bread would do if it were present. So the objection is saying that the operation of something follows its substantial form. And it's clear to us that what follows after the consecration still operates like bread, it seems. And so how does he deal with this argument?
Well, he basically agrees that the operations of the bread follow it by the reasons of the accident, which is the first sentence of the reply. But then he goes down and he says, but some other operations of the bread, either by reason of the matter, such that it is changed into something else, and that or else by reason of the substantial form, such as the operation consequent of blah, 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 because it continues to strengthen the heart. There's an internal, when you go to communion, you're just not eating bread. You don't walk away and say, boy, that bread tasted good. There's a bodily change within us with Christ present inside. And I think that's what he's trying to get at there.
Yeah, if we go back to I'm going to bring my whiteboard back up. If we go back to the matter and form, right? So the accidents or the properties that the objection refers to, the actually I'm going to bring back up here also substance accidents. The properties that the objection refers to are things that flow from its accidental characteristics. All right, its nourishing capability, right? And so they're not things that flow directly from the substance. And now let's look back at I'm going to bring up the text here. Okay, if we look back at objection 2. No, I can't write on it right now. Wait, here we go. Okay, yeah, in objection 2. Okay, it says that the form of Christ's body is his soul. And it cannot be said, it says that the soul, that the substantial form of the bread is changed into the soul, because it would seem, the reason for this, which is a little bit vague in drawing on Aristotle's De Anima here, what the implication is that it needs to be, if it's the soul of Christ, then it should show forth all of the characteristics of the soul of Christ, right? So these objections kind of go in reverse, or not in reverse. They go together, different perspectives of the same thing. This objection, this objection 2 says why it can't be. It talks about what should follow if it were the soul of Christ. This talks about what actually does follow, and so it must be the it must be the form of the bread. But let's look at, okay. So if we recall from the soul, remember there's a vegetative soul, right, for plants, for living things. There's a sentient, and there is rational. Okay, here. Now the higher forms of the soul include the lower. So the sentient includes the vegetative. The rational includes the vegetative and the sentient. But insofar, even before these things are living, they are material, they are body. And what Aquinas is saying is that insofar as the form of Christ gives the bread its bodily existence, it is present. But it is not present according to its vegetative and sentient and rational, right? You won't look at the bread and see it growing according to how a human person would grow. It's not going to respond in a sensible way as if you were touching an animal, right? Nor can you carry on a conversation in the mode of a person who is there in the flesh, right? So the soul of Christ is there giving this its existence as insofar as it is a body, a material substance, but not insofar as it is not there giving it its vegetative, its sentient, and its rational characteristics in that mode. How about, let's see, how about in the second question I have here, is it possible for the consecrated species to be both bread and the body of Christ? This would be consubstantiation, right?
No, because the substance would be changed into the body of Christ, and the substance is still the same bread.
So can you have one chunk of material being given its being by two different substances in the same way at the same time?
Are you going to say yes?
Well, I'm asking. I mean, I'm asking anybody. Is
Well,
it possible?
I'm saying no, but I guess I'm wrong. But
Right. No. You're correct. You're correct. I'm just
okay.
expounding on that. I'm giving the reason why you're right.
Well, I think if we think in terms of Aristotle, we think of that animation and the life form, or the life force rather, that is in something. But once the consecration takes place, it becomes a transcendent primary mode of being. And I think what I was going to say earlier is, if prior to 1200, when Aquinas got a hold of the Aristotelian philosophy, it changed everything. And what I want to know is, because I forget, what was the intelligence of the world community prior to Aquinas writing his Summa? Were they incapable of seeing the transcendence of God, and they were just living in terms of their imagination and sensations? Because Aquinas is trying to put the brakes on that and trying to elevate our sacrament to using rationality and he's seeking wisdom and rationality. But what was that? How did his audience react to this?
Well, to address the first part of that, I would say that Aquinas falls in a tradition of using reason and philosophy applied to the faith. So he's not alone in this. He doesn't come out of nowhere, right? He is,
Okay.
of course, he is of course masterful in what he accomplishes, but he comes out of a tradition out of which he was formed. And
Okay.
as we noted last week, St. Thomas was not only an Aristotelian, but he was also an Augustinian. His writing is shot through with St. Augustine. Mm-hmm. So he applies what was basically for Western Europe, a rediscovered language of philosophy to the faith in a way that was very effective. And so that's what he's accomplishing here. In terms of how he is received, at first there's a lot of controversy among certain philosophers, part of it being the fact that the church was grappling with all of the Greek philosophy that was being introduced, and in some ways suspicious of it being applied to the faith. So that is certainly a large project of what Aquinas is doing, and that's a function of his time. And but it was not too long after St. Thomas died that he was widely acclaimed as having compiled an unparalleled synthesis of Catholic theology.
So was the church populace able to accept the metaphysical understanding of the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist?
I mean, I would say that the church did. I don't know about, I really don't know enough about the history of it to talk about how this eventually trickled down, so to speak, to everybody else.
Well, because people today don't believe it either, so I just wondered.
Well, I wouldn't say that they disbelieved it then. I would
Yeah.
say that, I mean, of course, there was constant belief in the presence of Christ in the Eucharist throughout the entire history of the church. So it's just that Aquinas spoke of it in a way that was new.
Okay.
Yeah, the
I
third
wouldn't,
part,
I want, can I just follow up? I just wanted to ask, on the third objection, he writes, but some other operations follow the bread either by reason of the matter, the prime matter, such as that it is changed into something else, or else by reason of the substantial form, it strengthens man's heart. Shouldn't he have said and instead of or? The operations follow the bread either by reason of the prime matter, such that it's changed into something else, and it strengthens man's heart by reason of the substantial form, such as an operation consequent upon species, that it strengthens man's. Isn't it both and?
Well, yes, he's saying that some operations follow according to both modes, but they don't follow according to both modes in the same way at the same time. So that's why he's saying or.
Oh, okay.
So it's strengthening, the fact that it strengthens man's heart comes from one aspect of it. So I think that's the distinction being drawn there.
Okay.
All right, we're
Not
going
in
to
every
go
case.
on
Okay.
to the fourth reading. So Robert Sokolowski, this is an excerpt from his article, Steps into the Eucharist, where he's giving a phenomenological approach to understanding some key aspects of the Mass. So what were some of your impressions about this article?
he nailed it. He really showed the he uses the example of turning the altar around, and the idea of the priest being in persona Christi versus the priest being a representative of the people talking to God. And I that was, boy, that jumped right out at me at it. And that small thing that, seemed to make a big difference.
Yeah, so there he's illuminating how the text of the liturgy itself shows some of the different modes of presence.
The thing that struck me most strongly was the relevance to recent news, where the baptismal formula "we baptize" as opposed to baptismal formula "I baptize," and the church came out pretty clearly and said, you can't say "we baptize." You have to say "I baptize." And then you had that priest, I think it was in New York, that reviewed the video of his own baptism and realized he hadn't been baptized.
Yeah. Yeah, that was certainly a tragic revelation there.
It's the same issue that he's acting in the name of the community or
Right.
singular.
Yeah, and the text of the rite of baptism reveals it reveals certain things about it, and this is the key. So this is an important thing about phenomenology. So phenomenology, we're talking about the concept of intentionality, right, and looking at our experience of something, and the intentionalities that we have about it in a kind of descriptive way. But do we the different kinds of presence that he articulates right there in the first paragraph I have. He talks about the community in the minister, the scriptures, and the sacrament itself. Do we know those modes of presence according to our just our sensory experience of it, or some other way?
Are you getting it that it's not only our sensory experience, but it's also the words that are used in saying it? So I know that what Gerri was just saying about the baptism. I know that the priest baptizes, and he says some words and he baptizes. So my sensory experience is there was a baptism. That poor, that priest all his life, he thought he was baptized. But the reality is it requires more than that. It requires the words of baptism. And that's where you go back to the, he's not speaking for the church, the community. He's speaking for Christ. I baptize you. So it's more than just our feelings and what we think is happening. The language is very important.
So here's where, for phenomenology, that just if we can take a look back at Aquinas again. I'm not asking you to look at it, but just think about it. If we're thinking about Aquinas, where he's using deductive logic to come to truth, and what is added to that from reason is propositions that we get from the faith. And from the tradition of the church. In other words, that God is three and that God is also one. And so he grapples with this according to that mode. In phenomenology, similarly, we get truths from our faith that we incorporate into our intentionalities that we might have not have otherwise had. So we can't experience God in his fullness, Jesus Christ in his fullness in the Eucharist. And yet by faith, we can incorporate into our intentionality that he is there. So that this is another way that faith and reason meet. So before we had faith meeting Aristotle, here we have faith meeting another approach, namely phenomenology.
So John, can I can I ask you this? Do you mean like this is an example of phenomenology? Monsignor Pope gave a talk one time, and it was rather shocking to me, and it changed my outlook on the whole Mass experience. He said, in the ancient times, when a bridegroom came, okay, it wasn't here comes the bride, it was here comes the groom. So he said, when the bell rings in the beginning of Mass and the priest comes from the back of the church and he walks towards the altar, that's Jesus. Jesus is the bridegroom and he's coming for his bride. And it changed, my imagination just took off. And from that moment on, of course, he gave his whole sermon or a lecture on the Mass. And it was ad orientem. It was Jesus speaking to the Father, Jesus acting as both the sacrifice and as the priest itself. And to me, it was a play my whole life. When I read this article by Monsignor Sokolowski, it's sort of embarrassing that I guess it's because of my poor catechesis, but I just recently found out from listening to Fulton Sheen that during the consecration, when the priest consecrates the bread and wine, Jesus dies. But when he breaks the bread and puts it in the chalice of blood, of wine, it's actually the resurrection. So would you say these examples I'm citing are piecing together what phenomenology is, that it's inductive rather than deductive, or is it a combination?
I think that they certainly have that effect of they alter the way that you view it. They alter the way that you experience it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something that you get not just by being there, but by knowing your faith.
Yep.
Now to clarify, and this is a good example of bringing these two things together, of what you heard from Fulton Sheen about at some point that Jesus dies, that what, as Sokolowski is talking about here, what the Mass does is bring us back to that.
Yeah.
It doesn't bring that, it doesn't bring that to us again in a dramatic way, as if it happens again, like a play happens again and again.
Yeah.
But this is how the Mass is one. It actually goes back to the one event. Yeah, that's a good example.
Well, that's a dramatic representation that he talks about.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an interesting comment. Gerri and I were talking last night, going over some of the things that Father Hogan used to say, and you can have a misunderstanding of this whole phenomenology of, getting down to the gist. With after Vatican II and everything went out the door, rather than the family meal being like the Mass became like the family meal.
Right.
Yep.
So rather than taking the Mass and using that as the sacrificial meal and then relating that to what we do at the dinner table, it was the other way around. And that's what led to a lot of the confusion. It leads to a lot of confusion in the church today.
Right. So it gives us a responsibility towards the liturgy in a certain way, right?
Absolutely.
So, whereas a more descriptive phenomenology that might happen in secular philosophy is just that. It's more descriptive of just what we're experiencing and certain ways of drawing that out. Phenomenology in faith has a certain responsibility to employ the fullness of the truth, and so that we incorporate the doctrine and the truth of the church into our very experience, into how we view what and how we present what we're accomplishing in the liturgy. Okay, our last reading before I'm gonna hand it over to my parents. This excerpt from Elizabeth Anscombe. As I mentioned in the reading, she was a student of Wittgenstein, and we have some of Wittgenstein on our in our readings for next week. I'll get to that later. So, what did you think of this narrative here?
Did you give it to us because it was a classic example? Not classic, but it was an example of inductive, subjective, and experiential writing? Because she nails it at the end. I was a little curious the whole time she's talking, but in the end, she sticks with church doctrine. Was that a coincidence, or was it done on purpose?
Right. Well, I mean, that was certainly part of it. I think one of the main reasons I wanted to pull this out is just because it's by a modern philosopher in a different tradition than what we've been looking at. She's not strictly Thomistic. She's not really a phenomenologist. And those are the two approaches we've looked at here. She's an analytical philosopher.
Okay.
So she really breaks things down, but her historical account, well, let's just go from there. So other impressions about this. How about just any thoughts about how the arguments against contraception varied through the ages?
Well, problem is, I've got to assume she's accurate. I don't know, independent of her, if it's accurate or not. I mean, she's the one that pretty much sat C.S. Lewis on his butt, right?
I don't know that. I don't know about that, actually. That would be really interesting.
you don't have enough background about the way this was approached in medieval things other than to take on a word.
Well, just assuming for a second that historically, insofar as she relates to history, she's accurate. What about the just the justification for prohibiting contraception? How that changes through the ages, and how that relates to whatever their contemporary forms of contraception were, etc.
Well, it was a little disconcerting when I read that she said Christian moral teachings are not revealed mysteries like the Trinity. Well, it doesn't have to be a mystery. It's pretty clear cut, even if you know scripture at all. And when she started talking about reasons why it's okay to use contraceptive techniques because we've developed physiological knowledge, and she said a new question has come to the fore, and she says, I mean that of the rational limitation of families. And then she says, so no one envisaged a policy of seeking to have just a reasonable number of children. And indeed, the very notion of a reasonable number of children could hardly be formulated compatibly with thinking at once decently and realistically. In former days, it had to be left to God what children, how many children you were going to have. So it kind of made me feel like she was pushing the fact that the population's, getting too much. There's a limitation of resources she talks about. But in the end, she contradicts all that. I thought she was leading us down a trail that, was going to condone it. Instead, it seemed in the end that she was condemning contraception. Did I get that right or wrong?
You're right about the end. Yeah. So that part about why it seemed, according to modern science, why did it? Your part about how it. Let's see. Let me find that quote again. About the reasonable number
Right.
of
It was the
children,
third page,
right, to be
second
done.
column.
How that could be accomplished decently and realistically. Why was that new? I mean, what did she say about the previous methods of contraception and how they were viewed?
Well, the church viewed anything outside of the fertile period, the sex act outside the fertile period was also considered a sin, but it was a small sin.
So when she's talking about sins against nature, right? This about that part.
Okay, right. That's different. Yeah.
And about the view that there was a time that any of the acts that that were used to prevent conception were seen pretty much universally as shameful.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
Including abstinence.
Yes, including abstinence.
So I think, well, he's not talking in sins against nature. We're not talking about abstinence. We're talking about methods of engaging in sex-related acts.
Okay.
But without the possibility of conception. And that there was an overlap where all of these were also in some way, quote unquote, perverse or very shameful.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So So in that sense, it didn't even, what she's saying is it didn't even enter into anybody's mind before the modern period that there could be a way of actually having some, quote unquote, rational limiting of the family size that was, she says, both decent and realistic.
Mm-hmm.
So, because modern methods of contraception seemed to be more acceptable and less shameful, less indecent, less quote unquote perverse. So that what the point is here is that just changed the way the church had to approach it, which is kind of the whole thrust of this, is that throughout the ages there are different justifications or different reasons given for opposing contraception based on the actual methods that were available and the reasons they were used, right? And
Right.
then
Yeah.
Another point here is that about how related to this is how the Dark Ages, quote unquote, that's the phrase she uses there, that the view that contraception was on par with abortion and murder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because all of the known methods of contraception were abortifacient.
Right.
So it just didn't occur to anybody that there needed to be a distinction there, which means that along comes modern science, and there has to be a clarification and a distinction between these. So contraception it's not the same. Not all methods of contraception, that is, are the same as abortion or murder in that sense, in the sense of taking an innocent life, right? Now, some of these reasons given throughout the ages are based on faulty science, right? So,
Right.
does that negate the conclusion?
No, just because they didn't understand fertility doesn't negate the gift of life that the church has always celebrated.
So let's go back to here, and if we're going to go all the way back to our logic class, if we remember, in any argument we have a series of premises, right? Premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, etc., to form an argument, and then we have a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, it's quite possible that this can be wrong, and this can be wrong, and this can be wrong, and this can be right. And that's part of the point here, is that even human error can work to preserve the truth through the ages.
Right. Okay.
So even now, our understanding of the human person and how the human person works, how the body works, and conception, and our whole biophysiological history, all of that is going to develop, and we're going to realize that even things we thought we understood clearly now are wrong, right? It's probably not the case that we have it 100% right now. But the church preserves the truth through the history, and that's the point that Anscombe is making here at the end, is that that Pope Paul VI is preserving the truth that all throughout the history of the church was taught.
It was a surprise to me when she gave the history of the ancient abortifacients and all the drugs that the ancient people took. I wasn't aware of it. I knew the Didache talked about abortion, but I didn't know about all the contraceptive methods that were used throughout the ages at all. And I was sad that she didn't bring up the perversion of what these chemicals have done and still do to the female body and the female brain, and to the water supply for that matter. but I don't know. Maybe she's dead. Is she still alive? Is this-
She's not, but this is only one part of one article that's in a much larger collection of articles. So she might go into those other things. I'm not sure if she does, but
Okay.
you could follow the reference there to see if you can find the book yourself,
Okay.
if you're interested for more reading. All right, well, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to my parents. Dad, do you have slides or a screen to share or anything? No? You're just gonna go. Okay, great.
I'm just following my son's lead.
All right. Yeah, you can be the boss now again.
What's that?
You can be the boss again now.
Oh,
And then I get to boss for a couple minutes.
Oh, sure.
what's that?
And then I get to boss for a couple minutes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I missed that last article. It got tied up in the Sokolowski paper, and I thought I was finished with the Sokolowski paper, and I never saw it. Father Hogan wrote a history of. He wrote a small pamphlet called "Is NFP Good?" And in that he went through the whole history of contraception and how it's changed through the ages, very similar to the concepts here. And even in the 20th century, where Cassie Kanubi, when she talks about the Protestant in 1930, when the Anglicans said it was okay for birth control purposes, when there was a deep need, the Cassie Pius XI had issued Cassie Kanubi, which was a very strong condemnation, but he basically said that basically sex was for reproductive purposes only. And that's what led to the whole thing that, well, you can't, then if you're infertile, what about if you're infertile and all that stuff? And that's what Paul VI clarified in Humanae Vitae, that the four exceptions, 4 reasons why you could abstain. And then that led to John Paul II further clarifying it in Familiaris Consortio and a couple other things, where he brought it down. He cut the legalism out of it, as to make it more personal. But yeah, so this brings in Father Hogan, who was a dear friend of ours, who passed away 9 years ago. Very suddenly, he was a pastor of a very large parish in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he had a diabetic seizure and died. And which was, you're talking to him one week, and next week the phone's dead, and start calling around and find out that he passed away. But so we met him in 19. I'm looking for my notes here, Gerri. We met him in 1988 at a convention, and he had written the book. Wait here.
Covenant of Love.
He wrote Covenant of Love, which was one of the first, if not the first, a book on. He wrote it right after John Paul came out with his Theology of the Body lectures. He wrote it right afterwards. I want to say 86. The lectures were over in 84. He did it in 86, and he right off the bat he got into it, and it was the first one, as my dear wife pointed out, that she could actually understand. There was a couple before that, but they were way off, and John Paul's. So we met him, and he got into this whole. We talked about the inductive versus deductive and stuff like that. Hogan really pushed that, and so we came home from meeting with him and figured out, well, how are we ever going to do this? We were involved in the marriage prep program in the Arlington Diocese. I had not yet quite become at the diocese, but we were involved in setting up and changing it. And I started bringing it up, and everybody thought, no, you can't do this. We've been doing this way for years and years and years. You can't change anything. So it was at that time that I started, how do we personalize things? He keeps on talking about loving people and using things. And how do you actually do that? And it was then that I started working for the diocese, and Gerri started Project Rachel in 1995. And I was listening to her talk about women who were broken by abortion, and I realized that she wasn't telling them that what they did was wrong or that they had sinned. They already knew that. So what she was doing is she was basically embracing them where they were suffering, using language that they could understand. Inductive and experiential. She was telling them what they're experiencing now, and I think she's going to tell a story about that. She was affirming their pain, and then she was walking with them toward healing, which is the whole healing process of that. And then I go, well, that's nice, but how do I change a marriage program and the whole way people talk about pro-life and things like that? And then she brought out one of my favorite books, and the one that she had sold, The Apostolate. And there's a Francis de Sales quote in there: "You catch more flies with a little honey than a barrel of vinegar." And that sort of got me thinking that, okay, I got to do more than this. So let me pass it over to Gerri and let her give you some examples of how she uses a little bit of honey rather than a barrel of vinegar.
Before I do that, real quick, I didn't have a chance to jump in with the, can you hear me okay? Oh, okay. The birth control NFP discussion. The bottom line, that the difference between birth control and natural family planning is that with birth control, you're altering a major healthy functioning part of the body. You're basically making something sick within the body. With natural family planning, you're altering your behavior when you're going to, how you're going to handle the fertile times of a cycle in any given month. It's a huge difference. That's why the NFP upholds the dignity of the couple. You don't change the body, you change the behavior. And that's how it also leads to virtue. Okay, now back to the other. For several years, I had run the post-abortion ministry, which is called Project Rachel, in the Arlington Diocese. And I ran Gabriel Project as well, but I wanted to give you two experiences from Project Rachel, and then a couple examples of how changing the language freed me from a trap I got into in another situation. When a woman has an abortion, very often she's thinking of it as becoming a non-mother. In reality, she becomes the mother of a dead child. She experiences a sudden death, basically, when she has an abortion. Now, she's not told that she's going to feel that way. She's told that everything's going to be fine. The only people that ever have an issue with it are as if they already have psychological problems. So this is what she goes into this thinking. So when I would get a call, and I had training to do this, I didn't think of all these things on my own, from a woman who would say, I'm really depressed. I just had an abortion recently. And I can't eat, I can't sleep or anything. So and she would say, and there must be something wrong with me because they said that women just don't experience this, etc. And so I would ask her, when was the last time you had anything to eat or drink? She needs to have protein and sugar, basically, real quick, if she hasn't been eating and she's depressed. And she said, well, it had been a while. I said, well, can you go to the refrigerator, grab a piece of meat or cheese the size of the palm of your hand and get some orange juice or soda or something, and then come on back and we'll talk. So she would do that and come back to the phone, and while she was eating, I would start out, and this was a Hogan one-liner I memorized, was, of course, it's normal for you to feel that way because your body's the expression of your person. And what you just experienced physically was so traumatic, it affected your hormones, and then that leads to depression. And when you're depressed, you don't want to eat. So then you don't have any energy and you're not sleeping properly. So I said, given what you've been through, it's normal to feel, basically gave her permission to feel crappy. It's okay to feel crappy, that's normal. And the reaction, surprisingly, the first time I did it, I thought, well, let's see what happens, was, oh, really? Oh, I feel so much better. So basically you meet her there. She doesn't need to be told that she just aborted a baby and now, she's gonna have to deal with all those issues because it was wrong. That's not where she is. She's hurting, she's depressed. So you go, what do? You do the thing you would do for somebody hurting. Basically, her feelings, which can be subjective and experiential, are telling her she feels crappy. The objective truth is there's a reason. There's an objective truthful reason why she feels crappy. The second example I wanted to share with you is I got a call one day from a woman from the National Organization for Women, which of course is pro-abortion. And she said, are you pro-choice? And I said, well, we're pro-woman. She said, well, do you refer for abortion? And I said, well, no, we're pro-woman and abortion hurts women. So we don't refer for abortion. So I figured she's going to hang up, but she stayed on the phone. So I said, is there something I can do for you? Have you had an abortion? Do you need any help? She said, oh no, I was the product, notice the word, the product of a rape. And I said, wow, I'm really glad that your mom, chose life for you. I didn't use the word abortion. I said, chose life for you. And she said, oh, I would have understood if she didn't. So I let that sink in for a few seconds. Maybe theologically, when she meets that baby someday, the baby will have understood. I don't know. But I let that sink in, and she still hadn't hung up yet. So I asked her she said, her mother, I said, how's your mother doing? She said, not well. She really suffers from that rape. And I said, we can help her with that. So I offered to help, and she said, no, if we need anything, we'll call you back. That was the end of that conversation. Now, the other situation was one that, and this was several years ago, I was invited to give an overview of at least this is what I was told I was invited for, to give an overview of the post-abortion program in the diocese and Gabriel Project, which was a parish-based pregnancy assistance program. There's a girl from the high school constitutional issues club called, and she asked, it was right around the March for Life. So she said, can you just come in and maybe give a 15-minute overview of the two programs? And I said, sure, I can do that. So the day before I was supposed to go in, she called me again and she said, are you still coming tomorrow? I said, yes. And she said, okay, I just want to let you know, we just have someone from the other side who's going to present something as well. And I said, is this going to be a debate? I said, I do ministry. And she said, oh, no, it's not a debate. No, just come. We just want everybody to hear both sides. So I went to the school. It's an after-school program. Walked into the classroom. It was packed, standing room only, mostly students, but there were several adults in there as well. And behind me walks a lawyer from the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League. And we sat down at a table in front of the classroom. Now I'm getting a few red flags going up here. And when it was time to start, the student closed the door and she said, now we will have our debate. And she introduced the speaker from the lawyer speaker. And then she said, the contender, Mrs. Gerri Laird from the Catholic Diocese of Arlington. So I was fuming. I almost got up and walked out, but I'm glad I didn't because I learned a lot. So the lawyer started out, she talked all about rights and how anti-choice people like me, she kept referring to me, cause all these problems and women are they coat hanger abortions and all of these terrible anti-choice violence. And that choice, of course, is a religious term. And, that's why. And so they're starting to throw it over like that toward me and doing a little bit of booing, not too much. They were still letting the lawyer, and she was talking about rights. Everything was rights. And then she said, and when life begins depends on one's perception, which is classic subjectivism. And of course, if you're familiar with that Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that case in 1992, in which it was determined, and this is a quote from them, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. So basically, we can define our own reality. So then it was my turn. I had all my notes on an index card. And when I started to talk, I wanted to give a few cases and I had a few statistics. Every time the lawyer kept interrupting me. She says, oh, those aren't current statistics. No, you're wrong. Those are wrong. And the students got really rowdy. They were disrespectful. I hadn't said anything about God. I hadn't said anything about religion. I hadn't said anything. I was just trying to give a general thing. They were yelling at me for trying to shove religion down their throats. I was so perturbed. I leaned forward, threw my note cards up in the air, and they just froze. And then I had their attention. And then I leaned forward and I said, if your mothers had chosen abortion, this classroom would be empty. So they had it down. Even the lawyer was quiet there for a few seconds. And then they started raising hands, and every question came to me. And at this point, the lawyer could not get their attention at all. What if the baby has health problems? So I asked the student who asked that question, I said, do you have any friends with health problems? And she said, yes. I said, well, is their life worth anything less than yours? And she went, that, you know, like, and then I have one girl say, I don't see how a human fetus is any different from an animal fetus. And I think all you're going to tell me is that the only difference is a soul, and that's a religious answer. And I said, well, do you have a pet? And she said, well, I have a dog. And I said, when you go home from school today, you invite the dog to the table and you discuss what you did all day. Well, they all started to laugh, and she said, okay, I get it. So and then they were asking questions, do pro-lifers think that birth control is okay to prevent abortion? I went to the board because we had taught natural family planning for several years. I knew all about that. So I went to the blackboard and started writing things up there. And the girls were horrified when they saw what birth control does to the body. I had a few seconds anyway that I could address some of those. They wanted, what's wrong with teen sex if we're in love? So we ended up with a discussion on love versus use. I mean, the lawyer that all this time is interjecting things, I'm shoving my faith down, you know, down their throats and everything else, but they didn't want to talk about rights anymore. When they asked, one girl said, I wouldn't have an abortion myself, but I don't see how I can force, you know, my decision on someone else. So I said, who has the right to choose death for another person? Now that, they were quiet. They had to think about that for a couple seconds. So you have to go back, you know, from their subjectivism. Just because I believe that, it doesn't mean somebody else has to believe it. What's the reality? What's the objective truth? You're choosing death for another person. They said, what about rape? And I said, do you think it's just to punish the child for the crime of the father? They had to sit back and think about that. And then I threw a question out to them because there had been a situation in Woodbridge in which a teenager, she managed to hide the pregnancy from her parents. She delivered the baby, actually breastfed the baby a few times, wrapped the baby in a blanket, and then put the baby where she thought somebody would find the baby still living. Well, the baby was found and the baby wasn't breathing, but they were able to determine that she had attempted to breastfeed, etc. And people were outraged. The prosecutor, they wanted to nail this girl. You know, how dare he, she killed that baby and everything else. So I asked the kids, I said, what do you think about this situation in Woodbridge? Oh, that girl, oh yeah, that was a terrible thing. And I said, well, you know, she could have walked into an abortionist's office, paid a lot of money to have that baby's life taken, and it would have been perfectly legal. What's the difference? They had no answer. So this discussion then, it carried over, and some of them actually emailed. We had a lot of emails back and forth. And one girl did change her mind about being sexually active when we got into the whole discussion of love. A couple of them said that they had changed their minds on certain other aspects of it. But the bottom line to the whole thing that I didn't realize at the time, because I thought it was a disaster until I went back to the office and shared some of this with my office mates. And they said, well, now wait, let's look at this. And you might have made some progress. Basically, the lawyer was using language that was legalistic and authoritarian. And then she's talking all about rights. Well, how do you grab rights? What I was able to do was to talk to them on the personal level. They moved from attacking me and my religious beliefs to actually having some consideration about their own dignity and the dignity of their friends. I didn't want to take too much of your time, so just hit on a few of them.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
It's excellent.
There were several other cases, and I learned more by just watching her and her staff work. And I want to give one example. After I left the diocese, I went to work at Tepeyac Family Center. And by then, my whole idea was I was going to change Tepeyac Family Center and get them all talking, you know, in using this new language. And the way I did it was again very Father Hoganish. He basically says, well, I can take, we can take John Paul's theology of the body and reduce it to something very, very simple. He says, we're all made to the image and likeness of God. God presents himself visibly on earth in the form of Jesus Christ. The one thing that Jesus did more than anything else is love. So giving for the good of the other, even until death. So if we're made to the image and likeness of God, we should treat everybody as if they were Christ. And so what I did, whenever I interviewed a staff person, a new hire coming into the office, and whenever I talked to anybody, I basically said, listen, all I want you to do is when you're on the phone with somebody, if you're bringing somebody in the office, if you're telling somebody some bad news or whatever it is, just think that they're Christ. The whole idea, what would Jesus do, WWJD, that those arm bracelets that were for many years, very true. What would Jesus do? And I said, just treat everybody as if they're Christ, and then you're going to love them. And that approach is the approach that we used. We ended up using it at the diocese, and then we had to do it. We did it at Tepeyac. It worked very well. Well, how did this whole change come apart? I mean, we were crazy. How many years and centuries did it take people to really understand Thomas? And here we were trying to implement John Paul II's, we call it the theological thought of John Paul II, as opposed to theology of the body, because the theology of the body is just one part of it. And, Father Hogan basically took the further development of that, theology of the family, which is from Familiaris Consortio, and the theology of the church, which was many of the documents that he wrote after that. And, we were taking Hogan's language, the idea of you love people, you use things, and we brought him into our pre-Cana program. So here's the deal. He was in the diocese. He worked for Priests for Life at the time. The last quarter of every month, he had a meeting all day Friday, and then I found out he was in town, so I booked him in a parish, and he preached the homilies all weekend in the parish. Pastors love that. So, matter of fact, the name of his the title of his homily was the same homily he gave all the time. I'm pro-choice, and he used that as to get to talk about this whole theology of the body and why abortion is wrong and everything else. But so we had this gap between Friday afternoon and Saturday evening. And so my dearly beloved wife says, well, geez, rather than looking for priests to do marriage preparation, which was Friday night and all day Saturday, why don't we ask Father Hogan? So we did. So now Father Hogan is a medieval, his PhD is in, his doctorate is in medieval church history. So the first time I come in and Father says, well, what do you want me to talk about? I said, well, here's how we do it. We start off with the church, then we go to the family, and then we talk about the person of marriage, Saturday afternoon. And he says, well, what do you want me to talk about the church? I said, why don't you just give a history of the church? How long do I have? And I said, you got 45 minutes. And then the couples will talk. And he says, you're asking somebody that has a doctorate in church history to give the history of the church in 45 minutes? And I go, yeah, that's about it. So off we went to the weekend. And he talked the entire 2.5 hours Friday night. Nobody got a word in edgewise. The couples were on the chair. He was telling these crazy stories. He tells a story about Khrushchev. Khrushchev is the one at the UN, took his shoe off and banged it at the table. And so he says, yeah, there's a story that the Pope invited, John Paul invited Khrushchev into the Vatican, and they had lunch together, and Khrushchev took off his shoe and started banging on the table and says, Holy Father, I'm going to shut down your church. And the Pope got up and walked down to the other end, put his hand around Nikita, and he says, Nikki, people have been trying to shut down my church for 2,000 years. As a matter of fact, Christ himself hired somebody who turned out to be a traitor. So they've tried this all along. You're never going to succeed at it. Of course, it was a joke. It never really happened. But he had the couples. Many times we were doing the weekend, and so Saturday at 5 o'clock, I had to get him to a parish because he was going to do Saturday Mass. I'd come down, drive and pick him up, and there they are. about an hour after the end time of the weekend, still asking him questions.
Wow.
So we did this one time, we did this second time, and then we were out at a friend's house Thursday night before we started with the team for the next time, and Father came to me and said, Bob, can I make a suggestion? I go, yeah, sure, anything you want. He says, you really got it backwards. You're starting with a church with the, establishing the hierarchy of the church and the magisterial teaching of the church, and this is a teaching on marriage and blah, 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 blah. He says, you got it wrong. You got to start with the person. You got to start with the person, then go to the family, go to the church. So we switched around. So I said, okay, so we got a napkin out, never forget it. The two couples were beyond themselves. How are we going to do this? So that night we rewrote the marriage prep program, starting with the person and going to the family and then to the church. And we, so we were basically, as we were doing it, we were teaching it. And we had to, and I mentioned last time, it's a new language. It's a new language. And John Paul talks about this. It's the language of the body. So it's just like learning a new language. And one of the rules that I had for anybody that was doing marriage prep, or anybody that's doing any ministry for us in the diocese, they were not allowed to use the term theology of the body. They could teach the language. It's like, they would go in and they would start explaining what theology of the body is. Well, it's like learning Spanish, and before you learn Spanish, you're explaining the whole how Spanish language came about and all blah, 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 blah. No, you just start learning the language and learning to speak it. So we basically started learning the language. We love people, we use things. And we basically completely transformed the entire marriage prep program, the pro-life program, Project Rachel and Gabriel, which Gerri had already done, and everything else into that language. And then we went over to Tepeyac, and we got the staff working that way, which was really amazing in patient care at an OBGYN practice, doing it that way. So then, so that's about it at the diocese. And then we got hired, then it coincidentally, and Father calls this the Holy Spirit working. Both he and I were named to the board of the Couple League at the same time. And at the second meeting we were there, they basically asked Father and I if we could take the entire natural family planning course, which was extremely legalistic. Here's the teachings and here's the encyclicals, and you got to do it this way or else. Turn it into the language of the body, which Father said that I would only do it. He would only do it, and he gave us 6 months time. He spent 6 months working on it, and he and Gerri were the ones that basically put the thing together. But we basically took an entire national program, the largest NFP program in the country, and got people thinking differently. And it was we figured it took about 2 years of intense work. So we would begin using the language ourselves before telling people that we were doing it. And with the couple league, with all the magazines and the newsletters and everything going out, and all the introduction to with the couples, we were using the new language, and then we basically told them that that's what we were doing. But it's very transformational, and as Gerri's examples were, it made a huge difference in our ministry and the way we were able to explain it to people. Any questions?
I think it's easy for people to be able to block legalistic language, but not loving overtures. That's pretty tough to walk away from.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It was we really found it in the OBGYN office in Tepeyac.
I belong to Tepeyac too.
And we had, and by the way, the staff was only 50% Catholic.
Yeah.
And it was very, very easy to tell the Southern Baptists. Seemed like the rest of the staff were Southern Baptists. It was very, very easy to explain this to them. And they would rather do it that way rather than trying to mimic what the Catholic teaching was on this, that, or the other thing. And it was very, very easy for them to do it. And you're right. It's much easier to sell. Even discussions with not good, the political area. You find an area of commonality. Find some area of commonality and reach people where they are.
Right.
Walk with them to where you want to get them. The one point that Gerri reminded me we got to make, and she sort of made it in her talk, but where we don't leave everything to subjective. We want to get them back to the objective. And what she did was she used the technique of entrapment. They asked the right question and she responded in the right way and got them thinking in a yes and no situation, legal or illegal, moral or immoral. And we want to take it the next step to do that. Now, fortunately, there's many organizations around the country that are actually do this. Scott Hahn, I'm trying to think of the names. My mind just went blank. I can't think of them. But there's a lot of organizations that do that. A lot of colleges, Catholic colleges, universities have courses in this. But the idea is this is not a philosophy. This is not a theology. This is a human behavior course on how to do that. And that was the beauty of John Paul II. He reached everybody where they were and he took them with him. He loved everybody. Right. And he was willing to talk to anybody, but he was also willing to point a finger and say, hey, ultimately what you're doing is wrong. But he did it in a very loving way, a very personal way, very experiential way. And that was a history. That's why I included those 16 points in that other reading. Those are from Father Hogan. He was very skeptical of John Paul when he came in. He had read Love and Responsibility and didn't understand it. Love and Responsibility was written before John Paul became Pope. He read it and he said, "What's this guy doing? Is he watering down the faith?" And then he began he wrote those 14 points out a couple years into the pontificate. Some of it he added later, but the two names, the Polish Pope from a communist country, and all this other stuff, and so he knew there was something special about this guy, and he was willing to take the extra step to figure out what it is, and definitely helped us. He definitely helped us in the diocese, and he has no idea how much he helped us.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. That was great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I've a couple new things that I hadn't heard yet, but most of those are stories. I was smiling most of the time because I've heard many of those stories many times, and they're great. So it just shows another way to use reason to arrive at the truth, and it's a way that is rooted in our experience of each other, in this more subjective way of understanding that is characteristic of the modern period.
John, can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, in Evangelium Vitae 99, that's where the Holy Father speaks to post-abortive women, actually, and men. And what you just said is what triggered it, because he addresses that, what they went through was a difficult decision. He starts with that and then goes, I don't have it in front of me, but basically gets through. And when and then he says, but you can heal through this, that God can forgive you for this. And then he challenges them to go out and help others, to basically take God's mercy and go bring it to others. But that's well worth a read, because it can pertain to so many things. But the Pope, he demonstrates it so beautifully throughout those steps in EV 99. Thanks.
Thank you.
So can I ask Gerri a question? I know we only have like 5 minutes.
Go ahead.
So Gerri, you know, we were talking about this last week, how it's become incumbent upon us now. We're forced due to the culture to change our language because anything that we say could be hate speech. And the trouble that I'm having is that I see a generation below me and my own generation where two things happen. I see a lot of pain, a lot of isolation that nobody knows why. But when we talk about the issues of the day, meaning life issues, number one, because the ramifications of contraception and abortion is so far reaching and people don't realize it. But when the subject comes up, the first thing that happens is it's a new ploy of the left. Oh, I'm sorry, we can't have this conversation. Oh, okay, well, that's just off the table. We're not going to have this conversation. No matter how you try to interject, there's no way you're going to have that conversation. Have you run across this? Because it's in regards to abortion, it's life issues, who the president's going to be, all kinds of sexual and marriage preferences. Maybe you can refer us to something that John Paul II had written, or maybe something modern like Trent Horn or something like that, how to break down the walls. We really need to learn to communicate, and the media is not helping show us ways on how to communicate.
No, they're not. But whenever it's a one-on-one, I mean, you're going to have at least two kinds of people. You're going to have some that have made up their mind. I know this because I'm dealing with some of my relatives, you know, that you can't discuss the issue with them because no matter what you say, they're closed. They've already made up their mind, whether it's abortion or any of the other life issues. And so with those, it's like, okay, stop, don't go too far. If you're going to agree to disagree, you make your point. And if it's only an argument, you're not getting anywhere. But if there are other people around, the one thing that you always have to bear in mind, if you can, is that there's likely to be someone within earshot who has experienced an abortion or had a loved one who's had an abortion. So if you're talking about that, the one thing you want to include in your discussion is that you realize what a difficult decision, and that so many women, more than 50%, don't just make that choice on their own. They're coerced. There's hardly any discussion about that. The coercion is very high for any woman or girl who makes the abortion. And they don't realize the suffering that a lot of the fathers of those children have, and even more so the grandfathers. The grandfather of an aborted child can suffer a great deal. And so when you're discussing the issue, if it can be done in terms of that kind of respect, and that, you know, that you feel badly, or if somebody reveals to you and they're upset that they've had an abortion, you know, they're revealing that, then the first thing I do is I tell them I'm sorry for their loss. What can I do to help? Just as if they'd had a miscarriage. It's to start at that point. So if you can, that's the one thing to change in the language. We spent a lot of time, we did a presentation we called Reframing the Abortion Debate. And at first, we did this throughout the diocese. We based it on a lot of statistics we had collected on about coercion, how women were coerced, and the high number of women, the high number of Catholic women and couples who've been, you know, involved in abortion. And that the number of them that will stop going to church because they feel that all Father does is just pound away at the evil, and then I'm going to go to hell, and all. That's what they hear. Sometimes that's not really what he said, but that's what they're hearing. So we wanted to educate the clergy as well. And at first some of the priests were like, you guys are just watering this down, until they heard the presentation. And then it was like, oh, all we were asking the priests to do was to include in that, before they even started talking about the evils of abortion, that there are, you know, assuming that there are, if anyone in this congregation who's had an abortion or been involved in abortion, please know, if you haven't already been healed from this or forgiven, you can be forgiven. You know, and there are a lot of factors, and just, it's changing, starting that language of the forgiveness and the mercy, and then, you know, whatever else they want to address. I would get upset. I cringe when they just show abortion fetus pictures, and they say, look, this is what it does, because it's an unfair showing. What about the beauty of life? We need to see the baby side. Don't just show an aborted baby? What about a beautiful baby? And so sometimes we don't do justice when we're discussing this or trying to show it. But anyway, hopefully that helped answer your question.
No, it does, because we talked last week about subjective and experiential, and now that we have a culture of everybody's has to see a video instead of reading a book. Nobody knows how to read a book anymore, I've discovered. I don't give them any more. But no, it is very helpful to zero in on their experience. I like that, especially if there's an audience. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. That's helpful.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks. So we're going to wrap it up now for this evening. And as I mentioned before, we've got one more bonus session on which is going to target a couple very common fields in modern philosophy, philosophy of language and philosophy of education. So on the, I sent out an email. I'll send it out again tomorrow just to make sure everybody has it. There is quite a bit of reading that I put up for this, which is why I put it out last week. So if you're going to participate in the discussion, and again, this is all going to be discussion based on the reading. So if you're kind of pressed for time, then I would kind of skim it, or limit yourself to one or the other topic, either the language or the education side, and there's certainly overlap between the two. Or just pick one or two of the readings from each. So if you've been enjoying the Aquinas readings, there's Aquinas in both of them. If you're enjoying some of the more modern philosopher readings, then there's modern philosophy in them too. There's Wittgenstein in the philosophy of language one. Like I mentioned, he was the teacher of Elizabeth Anscombe, who we discussed at the just before my parents came on. And in education, we also have one of my favorite modern philosophers, contemporary philosophers, Hannah Arendt. There's an excerpt from an article of her on current problems in the philosophy of education. So thank you everybody for joining, and I hope that you'll be back next week for the bonus session. And I might continue something like this periodically, something like a seminar in Catholic thought, where every couple weeks we'll meet and we'll just discuss some texts in Catholic thought. So so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thank you for joining and have a good night.
Thanks, John. It's been fun.
Thank you.